let's see, Lenore.
Hi, Lenore Stanton, FCRHA.
Great. And Ben?
Morning, everyone. Ben Was from Drainsville District Supervisor's Office.
Rachel.
Oh, wait.
So we Rachel's here, just,
Olivia's.
okay, I think that's everybody.
And we have our one more HRA.
Oh,
yes, Olivia is online.
Okay.
Hi, Olivia.
Hi, yep, just listening in.
Thank you. Great. Okay, so the next item on the agenda is our remote participation policies. The first thing we're going to do is a confirmation of our remote participation policy, since we do have a couple folks on the screen. So first, Virginia law authorizes the remote participation of members of any public body, provided that a policy exists to ensure that such remote participation is consistently administered. The WDU For-sale Policy Task Force adopted the WDU For-sale Policy Task Force policy for remote participation in meetings at our meeting on May 19, 2023. To comply with the policy at our meeting today, we will confirm that first, a physical quorum of the task force is physically assembled at our meeting location, and two, that the voices of the remote participants are able to be heard by everyone in the room. So Megan, can you first confirm that we have a quorum of task force members present in the room?
Yes, we have a quorum.
And then for our task force members who are actually on the computer, Ben, can you please state for the record your name, your location, and why you are participating remotely?
Hi, Ben Was. I'm located in 1437 Falls Hill Road. I'm unable to attend in person because of an emergency in the office.
Great, thank you. And Lenore, can you please state for the record your name, your location, and why you are participating remotely?
Sure, Lenore Stanton in Reston, Virginia, and health reasons.
Thank you. So I move that a physical quorum is present here at 3700 Pender Drive for the WDU For-sale Policy Task Force meeting, and that these members' voices may be adequately heard, and that their remote participation comports with our remote participation policy. Can I get a second? All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries. And then secondly, we did pass around, and at your seats, we do have the Workforce Dwelling Unit For-sale Policy Task Force policy for an all virtual public meeting. If you've had a chance to review, if we could get a motion to adopt this policy, just in case, we only have a couple more meetings left. If there's not enough for quorum in person, this will allow us to potentially have the entire meeting virtually. So if I could get a motion to adopt the policy for all virtual public meetings. Thank you. Can I get a second? Second. Any further discussion? All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. All right, that covers off remote participation policies. And then lastly, schedule. As far as an administrative item, we're still on track on our current schedule. Today we'll be going through the program analysis findings and some initial recommendations. And then we have 3 more meetings left on our schedule. And the next one will be full program recommendations. And then we'll do our kind of decision-making at the September and October meetings. So off we go. Next item is additional task force comments from the last meeting. Following our last meeting in June, were there any thoughts or suggestions, questions that had come to mind that you would like to bring up to the group after having had a chance to process the information we received? Scott.
Sorry, I know at the last meeting, there was a lot of discussion about trying to refine some of the market data that was presented. And I was curious if that was going to be followed up on at this meeting, or I guess in the following presentation.
I believe so, yes.
I think HRNA, are you all prepared to give some of that data refinement?
Sure. So we, for this meeting, really focused on kind of our initial recommendations, what we've had so far, some of the additional data refinement that was requested. We plan to incorporate into our final report and discuss at later meetings, but really wanted the discussion today to really focus on kind of our initial recommendations.
So I guess the recommendations are not based on the refined.
A lot of the refined data that we asked for adding comparables against local jurisdictions, information that adds a context to the program, but didn't necessarily directly relate to kind of the questions that we were trying to answer. So we thought that for now, it would really make sense to at least get some additional recommendations in front of you all for discussion, and then to really focus on building out that whole context.
Yeah, and I understand that for the comparison. I guess what I was thinking of is some of the market data that was presented. We were looking to separate out those new residential construction starts that were subject to a rezoning application, because those are the ones that would generate WDUs. And so I think there was, my view, it felt like there was some merit to looking at that data and trying to get that incorporated into the recommendations. But if there's an opportunity to look at that data and incorporate it later, I think.
It's something that I know we sort of have had discussions with the county on, sort of thinking through, making sure that we actually have the data available to be able to do that information. And then, you know, recognizing that would be a helpful data point, but something that we thought we would cover maybe later and really focused on, and at least from the data and our analysis to date, kind of where we're landing, at least on some initial recommendations to kind of start, at least get the conversation rolling around that. And then sort of the other pieces will follow up later.
I think we're trying to sort of do the recommendations will be sort of certain items that we could get more quickly. And I think the bigger picture ones and the kind of more complex ones we'll have at the next meeting. So I think those actually, that data might dovetail better into those recommendations anyway. Will help them, help the HRNA kind of refine that. And so we'll make sure that that's presented and taken into account.
Any other follow-on? Okay, then I think we'll move on to our presentation.
All right. Well, good morning. As mentioned earlier, today we're really going to focus on our initial recommendations. So to start, utilizing the findings from our case studies, the market work that we had presented on last meeting, and assessment of current program requirements, we've developed an initial set of programmatic recommendations. So they don't necessarily cover all of the recommendations that we would be opining on through this process, but cover at least a subset. And so the focus for today's discussion is we're going to talk a little bit about how we're going to be using our feasibility analysis to get to, as Anna was saying, some of the more complex recommendations, but really today kind of focus on, just based on the discussions we've had so far, where are we sort of initially coming to our conclusions? And so before we get into that, I do want to reflect back on kind of the challenges that you all identified with this program at the start of this task force. So on WDU sales, recognizing that WDUs at 120% AMI have the most difficulty selling and may be competing with market rate units. We've also recognized that the length of sales, particularly around those 120% units, have been a challenge. We also looked at looking at the 30-year renewing term of price control, thinking through the sales prices and how we could maybe right-size the pricing calculation to better reflect market realities, understanding bonus density and thinking through if there was an opportunity to change the sliding scale of providing those bonus units with WDU production, and then thinking through the geographies of the program and if there was an opportunity to extend the program beyond the boundaries that it currently exists today. And so from those challenges, these were the 5 areas that the task force is going to focus on. And then today, our recommendations are really going to start covering 4 particular topics. So we're going to talk through some initial recommendations around affordability levels, around adjusting WDU pricing, resale components, and then term of price control. Next meeting, we're going to talk about the geographic availability of the program, and then get in a little bit more detail and follow up on any of the recommendations discussion that we have today. So to start with our 4 initial recommendations, and we'll be diving into all 4 of these in a little bit more detail, but did just kind of want to at least tell you at the start where we're coming out. So on the WDU pricing, we've made recommendations to update the pricing model across a variety of different factors to actually better reflect affordability for families in the county today. In terms of optimizing affordability levels, we are recommending that the program shift away from targeting households between 100 and 120% of AMI. We are also recommending to adjust the resale calculations to be tied to AMI instead of CPI, because that better matches the future resale prices with what's actually affordable to households. And then on the 4th point, we actually are recommending to maintain the current existing price control of the renewing 30-year terms.
Just add one thing, in terms of the WDU unit pricing, I think we didn't sort of intend to, we wanted to use this as sort of the building block because, we typically update that sort of administratively, but we wanted to do that here in this forum because, so you all know kind of where we're going to be going, and we're going to try to do that at a, sort of have that update completed before this task force sort of fully completes. But those assumptions will feed into the calculations that HMA will then look at in terms of the actual balancing of the WDU allocations. So just wanted to kind of let you know that that's sort of why this is sort of, we're going to kind of highlight it a little bit more here so you can follow our thought process. We can kind of, get any input on that. We're going to try to start finalizing that, but at least they'll be able to use that going forward.
And you're changing the ADU program as well?
No, the ADU program and the WDU program have different pricing models. So the ADU is based on construction pricing and WDU is based on affordability of the households. So the 30% of their income and kind of using that with all of the payments to determine your housing price to your max price calculation. And so this one, we're just focusing on the WDU price.
The resale adjustment is going to be different on the WDU versus the ADU as far as one being AMI versus one being CPI.
So I think that's a part of that conversation we're going to have during that time, because I think that's something we definitely need to talk through. But it's for now, I think we want to kind of hear what the recommendations have to say, and then we can sort of talk through the impact more broadly as well.
If I may, I would just add that, given the scope of what, the board asked us to try to do and kind of the urgency of resolving this specific issue, I think that downrange as we take some of these lessons learned and are able to invest them also in ADU program. Recognizing that we'll continue to stay on our, our principal task here for the purpose of the WDUs.
To dive into these recommendations in a little bit more detail, we'll start with the WDU pricing. So first, want to start with our findings that kind of led to our initial recommendations. So as we've discussed in this group, there's a lot of need for units to have their prices reduced in order to sell. As I'm sure everyone in this room is keenly aware, mortgage rates have risen and are continuing to rise. That's affecting the ability of households to afford their home. And then also this issue of condominium and HOA fees also have a significant impact on the ability for households to be able to purchase a home. And so taking those findings, we made some initial recommendations. And so the first recommendation that we did is prior to this task force, the WDU program has used an assumption of 2 persons per bedroom when pricing a unit. And we are actually recommending to reduce that assumption to 1.5 people per bedroom. this is actually better aligned with the standard that HUD uses for their programs. And also just based on the demographic data that we've seen for the county, we think it's actually a better reflection of how households are actually thinking about their housing choices. The other recommendations that we're making are actual changes to the assumptions of the pricing model. We're going to actually walk through the recommended changes to each of these in a second, but we recommend changing the pricing model to reflect updates to area median income, changing the assumptions as needed to reflect the current interest rate environment, changing tax rate and condo and fee assumptions kind of as needed to reflect any changes in the market. The additional change that we are making around WDU pricing is to actually include the cost of homeowners insurance when calculating the affordable sales price for each of these different AMI levels. And so I want to walk you all through a little bit about how changes to each of these categories actually reflects kind of the cumulative impact of pricing, both before we implemented these changes and then after. So just to start with the updating from 2020 to 2023 AMI levels. So AMI, the family of four, increased from about $142,000 to $152,000. So that increased the maximum sales price for both 71 to 80% AMI units and 81 to 100. So had a pretty significant impact just to reflect change in AMI. Now, we also then updated the pricing model to reflect current interest rates. And so interest rates have increased from 5.8% to 6.3%. That number would increase even further the longer that the Fed keeps adjusting interest rates, but that actually had the opposite effect, where we're now actually dropping prices from before. We also then made that update from assuming 2 persons per bedroom to 1.5 persons per bedroom. And in doing that, that had a significant impact in reducing the pricing. We also made some assumptions around HOA and condo fees. So based on data provided to us from the county on the HOA and condo fees associated with WDU units, as well as our own research around the fees that we were seeing in the market, we found that assuming around 30 cents per square foot for fees generally aligned with what we were seeing in the market. That being said, we are actually in discussions with the county around having a recommendation that while this be the standard assumption for setting pricing, if there was a development that came in with fees that were more than 20% higher than this, that the county would have the ability to automatically adjust pricing to reflect those higher than standard fees. And so doing that change, changing from the initial assumption of 60 cents per square foot down to 30, which is more aligned with what we were seeing, does actually increase the pricing somewhat. And then the final variable that we—
Can I ask you a quick I'm sorry,
Sure.
can I ask you a quick question on the HOA condo fees? Where's that data coming from?
So the data was coming from partially the county has condo and HOA fee information associated with its WDU units. And so that was coming out at about, if you were to take kind of the averages we were seeing for the condo fees and the averages we were seeing for the HOA fees and combine them together, was about 30 cents per square foot, recognizing some units only have an HOA fee and some have a condo and an HOA fee. We also did our own research. We surveyed about 9 or so for sale communities, some with WDUs, some without, and just collected our own data on the HOA and condo fees associated with those units. And we're also coming out with about 30 cents per square foot. We certainly recognize that there are communities that are going to have fees that are significantly higher than that. And so that's why we think it's important that the county have a mechanism to be able to account for that and manually adjust pricing when that situation does arise.
That's actually quite high, actually. I mean, so if it's a 2 for 2, you're not going to be. If it's a 2 for 2, that would be. Let's just do the quick math. I mean, that'd be $630 a month. It's like way high, like double the amount it really is.
When we had looked at the data, it was about 23, I think, cents a square foot for condo and about 10 or so for HOA. And so we wanted to set an assumption that was high, but still within the realm of reasonable. So we thought that dropping from 60 down to 30, recognizing this is still on the high side, made sense. If we think that if this is the exact number that we want to set it to, is something that we can like look into further. But I think the main point here was that we wanted to pick a number that was still conservative on the high end, but not necessarily one that was at the highest, at the maximum of fee that you would possibly see for a unit.
And then that's like for like a condo, actual condo flat, but like a 2/2, you would never be at that level. It'd be half that.
So I think, and also an important thing to note, and definitely don't disagree with you, is that our calculations are based on the minimum size of units that the county has required. And so for instance, for a 2-bedroom, that's around $200 a month. So it's like we're using the county's minimum size of unit to do the calculation. And so I think that is like, yeah, it definitely changes it. So it's between, for efficiency, it's about $135 a month, and then up to a 4-bedroom, it's around $315 a month. So it kind of falls within the range, yeah.
And so is the recommendation currently that the county staff has the ability to revisit the condo assumptions if the proposed condo fees are 20% in either direction or just above? Because to your point about sort of 2/2s being considerably lower, maybe it should be a substantial difference in either direction.
We had mostly discussed it because where it sort of came up, especially around the conversation around fees, particularly came up in the context of having some $60, $70 per square month fees. But I think to your point, the logic behind having that adjustment is just, if you want to have kind of a standard rule of thumb that you use to set pricing across the board, we also thought because there can be such significant variation in fees, that we wanted the county to have a mechanism to be able to override and change pricing. So I think whether it's 20% only on the high end, or if it's the recommended fees are actually 20% below, I think what we are most focused on is we think it makes sense for administrative reasons to have a standard assumption, but then the ability to change.
Yeah, that I would agree with that. And I would just say it should go, the ability to
Go in
change
either direction?
or down depending on the, you
Yeah,
can
that
set the
seems-
threshold of reasonableness, balances administrative, ease of administration. You don't want them tinkering with every single,
Yeah, right. And that's sort of the balance of trying to strike is like with this regimen was, how do we sort of balance the fact that we know fees are such a critical component to calculating affordability, but also trying to balance the fact we don't want to put the burden on the county of having to manually change pricing for every single development. And so this was sort of the thought about trying to kind of be at that, the Pareto optimal, if you will.
One thing that we kind of discussed, and I'd love to kind of hear from the task force too, is just having 2 layers, like 2 levels. So there's the challenge was, we know that, in HRI's research, they saw like development sort of had a mix of different ways of structuring it. So it's hard to sort of fit into one, but wondering if there is sort of like this lower density one and sort of a higher density one, where you might have, where it's like the, townhomes and maybe 2/2s fit into the HOA model, and then the condo model fits into like the, actual flats. I'm just curious about what people think, because either way, I mean, we're never going to get exactly for each property, and administratively it would be tough to have, too much variation. But I think like, that's kind of the conversation we want to have here, is like what really makes sense for the assumption, and balancing that obviously with, back end.
I think it makes a lot of sense to have it 2 different buckets. I mean, condo flats totally different from a condo, or even 2/2 that's a condo ownership, but it's doesn't have the same fee schedule. So, but on the other hand, if you are doing on the minimum square footage side, then I think some of that gets cleaned up, but you just have to look at the full model.
The other question I have, and this is actually probably for you guys as sort of developers, in terms of your fee schedules, we hadn't actually discussed it before, so it's kind of off the cuff, but we know that there's like required as like part of the condo docs, and that's like a labeled fee. Are there other required fees in developments that like wouldn't cleanly fall into some of these buckets that we should be thinking about? And like that maybe we call it condo and other required fees, something like that, because what we're trying to do obviously is find that affordable price, and just wondering, are there other parking, or not parking, because that's usually included, but other fees that might be charged that can, are a chunk, right? So not like a $10 fee for keys or something, but like $100 that you might be charging a month for something else.
I don't have any, John, do you?
No, I don't have, for the condo fees, with our condos, you basically, you have a condo building, the fees that are directly in that budget are just the box right around the building. So basically any kind of utilities, if it's like commonly metered throughout the building, you have those fees, any kind of maintenance for the building, specifically outside the interiors of the individual units, which of course are owned by the homeowners. Those are kind of all set. And then, kind of how we set up our communities, and I assume it's the same for Portland too, is, you have your condo that surrounds your buildings. And then if you have an HOA in the community, it would just be all the residual land, and all the common elements and amenities, things like that would be all fitting into the HOA budget. So that's kind of the breakdown but all that is kind of that's all been made public to the purchaser prior, so there wouldn't be any hidden stuff.
Actually, sometimes they actually have a reverse where, trash, lawn service, sometimes even internet, cable service are all sometimes bundled within that fee itself. So those will actually reduce the other expenses that person would have monthly. So keep in mind.
And then we made one last adjustment to pricing, and this was inclusion of a different variable. It's around homeowners and insurance. And so just based on some research into what we were saying, homeowners insurance quotes, just again, to sort of use as a quick rule of thumb, did want to account for an estimate about $75 a month in insurance costs. And so this is another component of total monthly housing costs that wasn't necessarily being captured in the data that we had to date. And so we did find that this did additionally kind of reduce the cost or of the supportable sales price. And so I know that we've talked through a lot of different variables that we changed. Some increase the price, some decrease the price. But when you take it all together, well, the pricing for efficiencies and one bedrooms do increase. When you look at the pricing for 2s, 3s, and 4 bedrooms, they actually do decrease. But most of the decreases are within about 5% or so. You do have some larger increases on the efficiencies, and that's partially driven by the fact that with an efficiency, there was no change to the person per bedroom count, because with an efficiency, you're assuming one person. But in general, making all of those changes, some adjustments to pricing, but not necessarily, in our view, any significant swings, but do just kind of want to sort of get your all sort of reaction and thinking to these changes in pricing.
One thing I'd also note, some of the changes we made are not annual, so in reality, when you're doing this every 6 months, it's going to be slight tweaks. Like it's going to feel less significant, even less than this. So this is even with going from 2 person per household to 1.5, major change in terms of pricing. So thinking through, it'll be even, the feel every 6 months will be even less. So it will hopefully not vary too much, and hopefully that'll create more certainty for folks.
Are there even thoughts about having different pricing for like single family detached versus a townhome, like a 4-bedroom townhome versus a single family detached 4-bedroom? Do you have that at all?
We don't have that product type in WDU program.
Never comes up.
We have one that's proposed. but it's outside of kind of the policy. Policy is directed at higher density areas.
It's-
You wouldn't have.
Yeah, not new construction though.
You wouldn't have.
One of the things that we'll be doing for our analysis next time is we are going to be taking these pricing and just understanding the financial impact that they would have. So we will be kind of looking at and answering that question, but did just at least as like a place to start, I just kind of want to walk you through the updates we're proposing to make and then sort of showing you all in, this is what we're coming out on that change in pricing.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about affordability levels. We have talked a lot with you guys about how do we better align affordability to meet the housing needs in the county. And the reality that the 100 to 120% AMI ban is being served by the market in ways that seem strong and exist outside of this program. So our findings here. And I think we talked a little bit about this last time, but 46% of all home sales since 2020 are actually affordable to households in that 100 to 120% AMI band. That's all home sales in the county that have happened since 2020. Households earning that 100 to 120% AMI level, they do have options across the county, including options of different sizes and locations and typologies. And 42% of all of the WDUs at 120% of AMI. So almost half of all the, WDUs in that level didn't sell. I guess we should clarify, this is based on data we have from 2020, right?
I think this is from a couple months ago, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's kind of a snapshot in time, compared to 12% of AMI of WDUs at 100%. So first, just kind of any questions on the findings there? A lot of percentages to process. We can talk more about those. Not surprisingly, we are coming out with this recommendation of moving the 100 to 120% AMI level for the program, so that you can really focus on serving households up to 100% of AMI. And also, we want you to think closely about the distribution of WDUs by bedroom type and how do we better align that distribution. Right now, the county actually doesn't get a lot of data collected on that distribution of units by, both typology and bedroom size. So we're going to need more data to be collected there going forward, and that's one of our recommendations as well. So right now you don't have to mirror the unit mix, but a 3-bedroom WDU would have to be. Well, we want to talk about the percent. Okay, sorry. Tell me what you think about those recommendations. We can get more into the data behind it if that's helpful.
And I guess just to be clear, we're saying that when the unit mix needs to mirror, it means that approximately the share of WDUs that are, say, 3-bedroom need to approximately mirror the shares and the entire development that are 3-bedroom. But we're not necessarily saying that they need to be the same typology. So they need to be within that 10% size requirement that's there currently. But we are comfortable with the current practice of WDUs being a different typology. So the size is within 10% and it's the same bedroom count.
I think the current policy is that they can't all be in one part of the development.
Right, we can all be on one
That is still,
floor.
yeah.
So right now you already have kind of the square footage requirement, so it can't be, a 2-bedroom in a WDU 2-bedroom can't be 1,000 square feet versus 2,500 square feet, right? And then you already have the requirement that they need to be evenly distributed in the building, no corridor kind of approach, right? But the thing that we want to talk through today is this recommendation of like the actual units by bedroom. So if you have 43 bedroom units that are market rate, wanting to mirror that with the 3 bedrooms on the WDU side. So you're not shifting, you're not getting just studios or 1 bedrooms on the WDU side. Anything else you want to say on that one? Definitely open to discussion. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought we had data very early on that said the current 3 or 4 bedroom WDUs were sort of selling quicker, more in demand. Is that accurate?
For for 100% and under, right? The 120s are still challenging, so.
Right, but for these income levels, 3 and 4 bedrooms, the highest demand and the quickest, the shortest marketing period.
Right.
So is there some thought about incentivizing developing more of those rather than the smaller ones? Because that's also in the research, that's where people shift to home ownership. It's when they start having kids.
Right.
So, you know, the affordable rental program generates studios 1s and 2s. The 3s and 4s are when people start looking for 3s and 4s, which are typically not available as rentals. They start looking at affordable purchases. I don't think currently there's a program to incentivize 3 or 4s versus studios 1s and 2s.
Right, well, and that's what we wanted to talk and get your feedback on, because right now there's nothing in the policy that really relates the bedroom types to the development itself. So we would want to, and what we're getting is, except, well, I guess in Tyson's, there is proportionality, but that's the only area. So you can get a mix of smaller and larger units. But outside of that, what's coming in is a lot of smaller units. I guess we don't have a lot of examples, but you know, in the examples that we do have, we're getting smaller units when in the building there are larger units available at the market rates. So we want to see if we can kind of balance out the program, and you know, we could do it in different ways. We could see if we could expand that proportionality policy to the county. I think what you're suggesting is perhaps something even different, which is maybe looking at a different structure entirely, where we would really encourage not necessarily proportionality, but just having larger units. Because I think the, you know, when you look at how the pricing model is shaping up too, you know, you're going to have an increase in efficiencies, and those aren't necessarily that desirable anyway for condos. So, you know, I'd love to hear more about and explore more an idea of like how you might set up a program that you know, maybe you have fewer units, you know, as a percentage of total units, but those units can be big. Those units would be bigger, right? And I think we'd love to sort of talk through how that could happen, you know, and how, you know, it's not. I mean, you don't necessarily need to look at like having a sort of a neutral price point or something like that, or like the law, you know, neutrality in terms of the financial loss. But I mean, you know, I think it might be a consideration to kind of like equitably balancing, you know, a program where you might have a certain percentage of units that might be proportional to what's in the market rate. The WD is proportional to the market rate in terms of the bedrooms. But then maybe there's a second structure set up where you might do fewer, that you'd have a lower percentage of WDUs, but those units could be larger. Yeah.
And I agree there, that if the goal is to incentivize the larger units, then I think people in the program, and I think Bill brought up last time, and we've done it in some of our zoning cases like Arrowbrook, had a couple other examples where within the WDU proper, you actually get more credit for providing 3-bedroom and 2-bedroom units than you do for efficiency. So it counts as like, a 3-bedroom counts as like 1.5 WDUs as opposed to efficiency, I think actually counts as like 0.75.
And I think Bill had talked to us about that example as well. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we've been talking a lot about how to encourage lower AMIs in this group, for the kind of like an ideal AMI, but we really haven't talked about that bedroom piece until kind of like the last meeting. So it's an area where we really need to explore it. So you know, if that's an example that's working, maybe that's something that can be expanded throughout the county.
That, in that example, is that tied to the actual bedroom count, to the potential number of persons that would live in that
It's tied to better.
bedroom count? Okay.
Did any of your research, and it might have been outside your scope of work, when you looked at other WD programs out in DC and Florida, I know, did you look into the proportionality issue there with what other jurisdictions do? It might have been, I know it just recently came up.
I was gonna say, I know generally like best practice is just to mirror kind of the market rate distribution. And so that's what we've really seen across all policies. Wasn't necessarily as prevalent to have this proportionality change.
I think the way we typically model any type of inclusionary zoning programs, our standard model is a proportional. So I think that, yeah.
The problem, I mean, I think it makes sense on like maybe like a condo unit, like a flat condo flat, but like, you know, a lot of our projects now are like townhomes and 2/2s. And it makes logical sense that, you know, the 2/2 is a 3-bedroom, 2.5 baths. It's a good product, right? But you'll have like, let's say like 100 2/2s and then like 50 townhomes. Well, the townhomes will be like $1 million townhomes that will be like 4 to 5 bedrooms. And then the 2/2s are 3 bedrooms. And it's like, so are we really saying that we need to make, you know, the $1 million townhomes now WDUs? I mean, it makes the project a little less viable, and it's, I don't know if that's really what, you know, makes sense from just a practical standpoint.
How we were envisioning it, like in this particular scenario, is that it would be less, like you could have a townhome development where your WDUs are in a 2/2. We think that that is viable. We think that actually makes a lot of sense. We just really care about trying to mirror unit mix and unit sizes.
You can't change, all of the buildings are standardized in product, and like there is no variations anymore. Like we're not, most builders are doing that. And you physically can't put more than 3 bedrooms in a 2/2. It's just not, I mean, and then it's just not viable. I mean, unless you're taking a laundry room that's like tiny and you can get another bedroom. So I think, I don't know if there's like a threshold that says, you know, maybe on a condo flats differently than, you know, just a townhome 2/2 type community, or it's just like to see it more refined. So it's not just an even split, even distribution.
Yeah.
Because even like when we're doing, we'll vary our unit sizes and maybe like use, because we're actively, well, we're building predominantly affordable. But we're actively looking to cross subsidize, so sort of maximizing the value. Now, our ratios are kind of reversed. We might have 2 market rate units in a 5-unit or 10-unit affordable or 10-unit townhome development or something like that. But yeah, that's, I mean, obviously this won't be in the context of WDU, but but it's this principle that kind of that you're talking about, that maybe there's something with like setting a threshold at like 3-bedroom with, you know, proportionality. You know, you're proportional unless like all your WDUs are 3 bedrooms and above, so which sounds like
Yeah, you're exempt after you hit 3, you know.
yeah, something like that. Because 3 is like a family size unit by anyone's definition. So maybe like in that kind of context, you can.
Interesting, because last week attorney went over the data that so much of the inventory that's coming is 5-bedroom plus. And so just sort of thinking about that data in the context of this conversation, like, are we kind of getting to a point where you will never have affordable 5 bedrooms, or, you know, and yet the market is producing them, right? So like, then is there going to be this?
You would do it if it's a town only community.
Yeah.
And so if it's town only community, because you can price them higher, you're going to probably create the bedrooms. I mean, when I did Loudoun County, we did a bunch of projects, we would convert our houses from 4-bedroom to 5-bedroom with a pricing schedule. So I think, you know, you'll see the town communities and where builders go ahead and enforce that extra bedroom or whatever. But I think there's just some projects that are just, yeah, a variety of different product types, and that higher tier price point, you know, is on the higher bedroom, and it's just, you know, are we really going to make that WDU in a ultra luxury, you know, $1.2 million townhome over $1 million townhome?
Yeah.
almost like we need to see the pipeline and see if, you know, if there will be 4+ bedrooms produced and if like, but for sort of a trade-off in getting, you know, somewhere through the proffers that it, you know, if they wouldn't be produced otherwise.
And correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of the five, the sort of what's being produced on the new development, that included sort of like the big tear downs and the single family infill, you know? So like, how much of, you know, I know that a lot of what's being produced is the 5-bedroom and out of new production, but what proportion of those, of what we're actually talking about here, which is like the like the bigger developments, the not one-off, you know, buying a $400,000 or $500,000 tear down and building a 4,000 square foot 5-bedroom home with a custom builder. Like WDU doesn't affect that at all. So really our universe of comparison is sort of our pipeline has a different denominator in terms of the number of, you know, 4+ bedroom.
Full circle to that. That'd be helpful for the next.
Okay, so we're hearing generally, everyone recognizes the need to think through the distribution, collect better data there, look at pipeline, and figure out also if there is a threshold or within the like proper, you know, is there a level at which you would get more credit for doing a certain number of units?
The other, the important thing to come out of this meeting, just to kind of bring everyone back, is that those 2 bullets and initial recommendations are really going to be the baseline for how HRNA creates sort of some scenarios around the the proposed WDU like allocations. So just wanted to kind of like make sure that we kind of give them guidance. So do you feel like you have kind of what you need? Do you need more units to kind of like make sure we talk more about it, or is everyone kind of good with what's on here for them to move forward with?
Ideally, if we're going to have this distribution difference, it's in the guideline and it's not negotiated case by case.
Yeah.
But straight out, everyone knows what it is. So it's the guidelines or in the policy. I don't know where best part is in the guidelines versus the policy, but.
And maybe, you know, it's just like a formula. So, you know, a 2-bedroom is equal. A 2-bedroom is the baseline for a WDU for your WD requirement. A 1-bedroom counts as 0.9, that efficiency counts as, what do you say, 0.75 or something like that. And then you could have sort of like, you get the biggest performance bump if you're at 3, and then maybe like diminishing after that to deal with that sort of like hyper luxury. Like there's less demand for 6 bedrooms or 5 bedrooms. So like then maybe there's you get a big bump in your credit, the credit you get the formula to go from 2 to 3, and an okay bump from 3 to 4, and then like after that, you know, you can play with that dial a little bit, and that creates that kind of certainty if you have that formula.
Quickly, for the recommendations you're coming up with for our next meeting, are you planning on doing any sort of test cases of running these recommendations through like a typical pro forma, so we can understand the difference in the economics per project?
Yes. John and Mark can probably attest, we've been pestering them for
I'm sure.
to confirm some inputs, but yes.
Coming, but I know the current policy is 12%. It needs to be 12% split between 80 and 100, or something different.
So that's something else I think we're going to be looking into in terms of how you're breaking it down.
Greg, can you also talk about sort of under 80% and what your sort of analysis or kind of where you're coming out on whether we should be looking at lower incomes as well?
So we're looking, I think this is 71 to 80 and 81 to 100. We're not recommending that the WD program be amended to target AMIs lower than 71%.
And mostly, and we can talk more about this, but we don't see a need to overlap with ADU and the income band that the ADU program serves.
To kind of like open that up. since we have some stakeholders in the room, there's everyone's thoughts. It's really, so this is really focus on 80 and 100% EMI. Okay, well, I guess.
I mean, ADUs are not gonna be triggered by high-rise condos. Maybe triggered by 2/2s and townhomes. But high-rise condos is never gonna trigger it. Or some of your multi-family conversion, that convert to condos may not be triggered too based on the building type. So, I mean, it may or may not overlap in that sense.
Yeah, just really briefly on that topic, I think that, it is an important point, especially given where we are relative to the productivity under the ADU program. And, at some point, I think we may need to really consider what that looks like, given that the ADU program is, in my view, relative to the WDU program, is producing less and less housing these days.
That's only because we're not able to maximize the density of some of these sites, get the bonus density. I mean, I've always been a big advocate of have different price tiers, because if you're utilizing and getting a density bonus, then all your units should be ADUs, not WDUs.
I certainly understand that. I raised this just, because as a community, I think we need to kind of understand what the limitations of the ADU program are in the market right now.
I would add that, some supervisors were also profiting under the 80%.
Right, and just sort of following on that, not to cross-fertilize ideas from the rental piece of this, but, there was, at least in the Tyson's Urban Center, a possibility to be able to proffer into a lower, income tier. Now that completely different economics, totally understand that, but, I think maybe we kind of keep that in the back of our minds here as we move forward.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful maybe just to kind of run that scenario though, just as you're sort of looking and so we can see the trade-off. I think I sort of share some top concerns. So it's like, what is our kind of pipeline of both programs? And then if this is really going to be sort of the future producing a lot more, then, will we get to a point where we don't have as many ownership opportunities for, 60, 70% AMI households? So, definitely a concern. And there's other ways we can reach those households. It's, just nice to have a program like this do it as well, or,
I think that, to your point earlier, that we're peers really focus on WDU, but that there will be some overflow into looking at how these two programs work together. For us, that's like an important part of the overall driving production.
Quick question. So they changed the zoning ordinance a couple of years ago where 2/2s are now considered townhomes. And then these, for all our projects, it triggered a lot more ADUs. And so we don't really have too many WDUs coming up going forward. So are we just looking at a narrow window of projects that you're having right now, or a lot of WDUs just because that change wasn't in effect when those got zoned, but now new projects are going to have a lot more ADUs versus WDUs?
that might be why. That's probably right.
It really makes it important to consider how these programs are working together. It is challenging to just look at one, so I think that is sort of our overarching recommendations towards the end.
On affordability level. This was just kind of backup data showing the this was a slide from last time showing the differences in what's affordable. Just reset on it.
Yeah, okay, I can talk about this too. Sorry, we're gonna talk through this idea of changing CPI to AMI to better match the resale prices with what households can actually afford. So we looked at DC, we looked a little bit at California, so we've been, generally coming up with the notion that we should be shifting this policy toward AMI, not CPI. In DC, there's actually a cap on AMI, so we're looking at that as well. And the reasoning here is, changes in CPI are historically more volatile than changes in AMI. AMI is going to be more directly correlated with housing affordability. And we do think that the initial recommendation here that we're making is to shift to AMI. We want to look more closely at capping that AMI and what other jurisdictions are doing and how to properly cap it. So that's what we're recommending. We talked a little bit about it last time, but want to hear from you guys about making this initial recommendation on AMI.
I think that makes a ton of sense. When I was doing consulting work in your type of seat, that when we were looking at inclusionary programs, we saw like some of the biggest, this for the resale, the challenges with resales, the one I heard most often was that like when you have your income eligibility tied to one metric, but then your resale price change tied to another, that's when you get those sort of mismatches where, and often this is in hot markets where CPI, where AMI and CPI may not be fully aligned. And so, and especially at low, so like you get, in some cases you are basically setting an expectation for resale price that's considerably higher than what an AMI level can afford. So I think that aligning those is probably, it makes sort of program simplicity sense. It makes sense on a lot of different levels.
So we've got a chart here just showing kind of how those three have moved and how maximum price, aligns. You can see the DC policy with capped AMI growth, and this is only going back to 2018, but it's a smooth line, and there's been more recent market fluctuations, of course, and that kind of does give that capping the AMI growth does give you it reduces kind of the volatility with market volatility, right? So we do think there's some value in that, but also recognizing that it's capping, it's going to cap potential wealth growth in homeownership.
This is actually one place, though, I think our strongest recommendation is to tie it to AMI. We've actually gone back and forth on capped versus uncapped, even just internally. And so I think that this is really a point on capped versus uncapped that we really actually want to solicit feedback from all of you on kind of your thinking about those differences. I'd say that's a place that we're really hoping to kind of hear from you all on what you think makes the most sense. Really, our biggest recommendation would be the change to AMI. That's, I think, where we are sort of most, where our strongest recommendation is. And then capped versus uncapped, we can talk about.
And I think it's a little bit, it might be a little bit simplistic to say just to say cap. So I just want to make sure everyone kind of understands what the calculation really is so that we can sort of discuss this. So basically, we're sort of talking about whether you're doing a annual increase based on an annual movement of the market. Whether it's AMI or CPI, there's sort of this annual thing that happens. Market does well, market does poorly, like you're sort of at the mercy of it, right? So the capped model, but like sort of this, it's really like a 10-year annual growth rate of the AMI that's used. So rather than saying you're at the mercy of the annual, what happens this year, last year, however long you've owned it, you actually have like a 10-year look back that you're smoothing out the growth. And so there's a more kind of predictable growth of your investment. And also there's kind of a, you sort of are sort of, you control for market fluctuations. If you only own the unit for 2 years, 3 years, you're not kind of like, oh, it happened to be a hot market or a sad market. It's just that you're kind of like, this is sort of the general expectation. So that's kind of, if you can sort of see that light blue line, it's a very smooth, it's very straight across because you can control basically for those bumps, up and down bumps. So that's kind of the arguments.
I was just gonna add that the other important component of DC, and it definitely, I think the 10-year compound annual growth rate is very it does help smooth it out a lot. In addition to that, DC has a limiting top line, so sometimes the CAGR goes above 3%, and that's kind of where it's hitting the cap. So it's kind of compound annual growth rate would be closer to 5%, and DC's cap is 3%. Yeah.
So for DC's cap, that's for both the sales price, but are they capping their calculations for say 80% AMI for income eligibility as well? Or is it just for the sales price? Just limiting the upside on that.
So as your AMIs are growing, so you say you're at 80% AMI, the actual sales price of new units is also going to grow, as we've seen with the AMI calculation. And so basically what the DC's program is, it says the maximum of either new units or this growth rate number, this CAGR, or the 3% cap. So it gives the option. But regardless, when you're tying it to AMI as compared to CPI, it is for 80% AMI households is still those 80% AMI households, but the actual incomes that they have might change. So I don't know if that's describing it.
I think you're asking if someone who's an 80% AMI buyer this year, if AMI goes up 10%, DC's policy still moves with AMI in that, in terms of who's qualified.
Sure. So I'm just trying to wrap my head around sort of the interplay between income eligibility and appreciation and resale price. So first of all, just smoothing makes perfect sense. I think that's kind of in some ways, I'll say no brainer, but I think that's pretty straightforward. But in terms of the annual cap and the growth rate. So if 80% AMI household gets an 80% price on a new construction on sort of year one, and then they live there for 10 years, let's just say. And then during 6 of those, it never goes below it never goes negative, but in a couple of those years, the growth is capped. So on it, their sort of resale price is lower than what it would be absent a cap. That 80, but it's just that standard for eligibility, that 80% AMI calculate, 80% AMI household 10 years from now. So it's in some ways getting their purchase price is a considerably better deal than what the person got in year one. And you could make the argument, and I could see the case that they're getting a 10-year-old unit instead of a brand new unit, so that makes sense. But I just want to think, and if you're having a problem with resales because of, it's more challenging, it's not a brand new unit, getting people in the resale market versus, they come up more episodically, so you're not as easily able to line up a pipeline of buyers. So there's a lot of reasons why it may make sense to give a resale buyer a slightly better deal than what a new construction buyer would get based on those calculations. But I think we should just be aware of that trade-off. And as I'm talking, at first I thought that was that's not fair. And then as I'm talking through it, I'm actually, there's a really good policy reason why you might want to do that. But I just, we should think through it.
So if you're the seller of that unit, would that incentivize you to just stay in the unit rather than putting it on sale if there's a decrease in the amount of equity you're going to be able to cash out?
So you're just not, under this scenario, it's only capped if the market's appreciating a lot. So you're still going to be getting a non-trivial amount of equity growth. So, yeah, I don't,
And that person now has to buy something else.
Right.
And they can't afford it because they just, everything went wow, and now they're really.
Yeah, that's true. It could. Now, the question is, are they going from, you know, if you or an 80% AMI household that gets, you know, 10 years of stable, you know, home ownership, earning a decent appreciation, you may not be looking in the ADU territory or WDU territory anymore after that. You might be going just straight market. I mean, that's what we kind of think of, like when we think of our home buyers moving on at Habitat, you know, if they're getting another income restricted affordable unit, that's perfectly fine. But, you know, we're thinking that, like, in the best case scenario, they're going, you know, moving up from the Habitat starter home to like a full market home. That doesn't always work out that way. And our buyers tend to want to, you know, because we also built like decent sized units too. So like, there's no reason that people often feel compelled to move because of family size changes. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of moving pieces here. I'm just sorry, I'm rambling a little bit.
I'd also challenge that, like, I think there's a separation of those two too. Like, I think that there's the smoothing out piece is a look back. I don't think we necessarily need to cap it. And I think when I worked on the program, we didn't cap it. So, but it was still pretty close to like I think it got to 4, maybe went down to 1, but there was this like fluctuation. It was just such a small,
Yeah,
you know.
you could definitely implement the compound annual growth rate and not implement capping that. And I think it really has been an issue in DC in the past like 3 or 4 years when AMIs are growing $10,000 each year. So I think it's been an issue more recently. But you could definitely implement compound annual growth rate. It smoothes it a little bit more, less variation.
We share their AMI though, so that's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, and if you have the smoothing, regardless of whether you have the cap or not, the smoothing probably takes away that incentive for just like strategic, like we're going to sell this year, or for like good out for people just being like, oh my gosh, the market just shot up. Like now's the time to sell. Like,
Very short term.
Like that very short term decision making, or someone being really, you know, if they have to move and they have to move for whatever reason, job change. And it happens to be in one of those years that really like where things tank on the bad side, like that I think the smoothing element will just like allow for just more consistency and people being able to not have to focus so much on the affordability calculations in making decisions about whether they want to move or not. I think the smoothing, and then the capping's a different story. It changes the incentives a little bit, but just straight smoothing, I think makes a lot of sense.
One thing I want to just note is that I think in general with their recommendations with resale is wanting to recreate a similar environment as would in the market. You know, when you buy a house in the market, you're not guaranteed the price is going to increase. You're not guaranteed the county is going to buy it. There is a level of risk. In the past 20 years, you have seen prices increasing generally, but you know, you are as becoming a homeowner, there is that part you have to consider is that you're taking that financial risk. And like these are all max prices. It's not a guarantee you're going to get the max price either. It really kind of depends on the year you're selling. That is what you have to deal with it as a market rate owner as well. You know, you have to balance those things.
Just a clarification on this chart. So the blue line is what they're proposing, uncapped and AMI.
So we've actually gone back and forth on this. So I know that at first we were thinking we would go uncapped, but sort of as our conversations have evolved, we actually think that it could be an open question.
Okay.
It probably is going to end up being in between the two blue lines. So going a compound annual growth rate route smoothes it out, but doesn't necessarily have a cap on
For
top.
the last 6 years, it's been a 6% annual increase on an uncapped. If it's uncapped, that's what you're showing.
Yeah. It will be smoothed a little bit down, and we can maybe bring that next time of what that just smooth line, but not capping it looks like.
One of the things that I really like about that approach is that it also begins to help address, you know, some of the concerns that we've heard about our homeownership programs relative to wealth creation. You know, these will be, you know, by definition, limited equity forms of homeownership. ownership. But what this does is it creates a little bit more room for wealth creation. And gives, also gives the owner household opportunity to grow their own income. It's important to remember that, like the rental programs, folks buy these units and their incomes, usually tend, to increase as they progress through their careers. So I think that is, I like the path that we're on in terms of addressing the sort of both capital E and small e equity part of this too.
So I think if you allow them a little bit more wealth creation, and I don't know what the experience is, but they tend to maintain capital expenses for the property a little bit more. Has that been an issue with, if you cap it at CPI, the real value of the house is just flat. So when you have to change a roof or,
Well, so there is a sort of a compensation, especially for major systems and major capital improvements, roofs, HVAC, and all that.
adjustment.
Yes, exactly. So that goes on top of the resale price, yes. So that's taken into account. It doesn't necessarily incentivize, or I'm not sure if there's a correlation in terms of disincentivizing like cosmetic improvements, right? So like you live in your home for 20 years, maybe your kitchen's outdated, everything's functional. So we would only do, I think the guidelines provide only a increase in your sale price for those like non-cosmetic, like, actual capital improvements. So, yeah, so hopefully that it doesn't track too much, but I mean, it does vary by owner for sure.
During the period of home ownership, I think that they cannot take additional equity out for those improvements. So that's something to be aware of. They would have to use their own cash to do that because the covenants sort of limit the ability to use equity to make improvements to the property.
You can't like over finance the property.
Yeah, you can't finance and use equity.
There's a lot of sensitivity about that in these programs, especially coming out of the 2008, 2009 time period, when we had a lot of challenges with owners over financing ADUs.
It's during, just to clarify, during the initial, which period does that apply to?
Well, it really applies sort of across the board.
Okay, that is always, you can never take equity.
Well, in this income control period, you can, but we'd like to say they can't eat into the FCRHA's equity share, or equity, the portion that would come to the FCRHA.
So someone that's lived in the house for 20 years, let's just say, and wants to use a home equity, they've paid down a lot of the principal balance and they want to get a home equity line of credit in order to, repair the roof, change out the HVAC. They can do that. They don't have to do that by cash.
I think they're capped at either the maximum, like the loan amount, or there's like a cap on it, right? But they can still do that.
So
Like as long as they're under LTV.
So just to make sure that they actually are limited to only refinancing the current balance of their loan. So they cannot actually use additional equity over where they've paid down to.
Oh, even though.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe that's something that, to talk about.
Yeah.
I was saying, because there are times when even within like the first 10 years of a home, that you do have a catastrophic system issue. Like, again, I'm thinking more like HVACs. Sometimes, you do get a let-in, or they do fail, or there's weather damage or whatever, or again, the roof as well. So could there be situations where that could be conditioned?
I mean, currently the covenants don't allow that. So I think that's something that would need to be discussed, whether, that's something to be opened up.
Because that ultimately protects too, that's the FCRHA's investment as well, especially when it's a systemic thing like that, right? If they're able to make that a real repair, sometimes insurance doesn't cover some of those, especially HVACs.
Yeah, and I know we've taken a look at some, like, occasionally, and this is before my time at Habitat, but I was told by a previous person that was in our position that occasionally people will come to us with, and I think this is more often on the ADU side than the WDU side, and said, hey, do you want to buy this? They haven't found a buyer that has a lot of deferred maintenance. The household's been in there for 10, 15, 20 years. And like, if we didn't actually look at the amount of money that needed to be put into that, we couldn't make it work. In some cases we can, in some cases we couldn't. But I would think that, if the issue is, again, cash, it's not necessarily, you don't want to lock people into necessarily a house, maybe not house rich, but house okay and cash poor situation. Like I said, it's someone that's been in the house for 20 years. The Fairfax County's share is probably pretty well protected given the principal pay down. So I think loosening, and maybe that's not germane to this working group here, but I would think just more of a global issue that like maybe you limit you can probably easily work around some of the legitimate concerns about not over leveraging these properties by having just a simple like LTV requirement. But like there's really nothing unsafe about, like I said, someone who's paid down half of their mortgage getting 10% LTV home equity line of credit in order to put a new roof so they don't have to pay for it out of cash. So I think that would really go along, give households a lot of options for keeping up with the property and protecting everyone's investment.
Comment on that, if I could, very briefly. Number one, I like the concept of some kind of, tied LTV. Need to be very careful about how we would structure something like that, given our limited ability to actually administer that over, potentially several thousand units, down the line here. But, I will also say that what that does, the benefit of that is that it then, helps reduce, the expectation that Fairfax County steps in at a turnover, to make such repairs.
So this probably is one of those parking lot issues that we need to parking lot, but remember for future conversations, given our scope. So I think it's, again, good topic. And we'll move along.
Okay, got one more recommendation. And that's around term of price control. But in this particular case, we're actually recommending no change. And because of that is when we looked at our case studies, there really was no standard affordability term for similar programs. They were kind of all over the place. Some were only 15 years, some were 99 years, some had this resetting affordability, some didn't, which means it's really kind of aligned with the particular jurisdiction's goals. And so in talking with the county, we understand that there is sort of this goal around, or this idea that to the extent possible, WDU should provide opportunities to more than one household. And so with that, sort of thinking about this reoccurring or the affordability covenant resetting with sales did make sense to retain. Additionally, in talking with the county, when you have this resetting affordability covenant, what it actually does is it makes it easier just in terms of record keeping. If the affordability covenant is renewed on every sale, the county only really needs to keep track of the most recent sale to have the affordability covenant information versus if you just have one that's put at the beginning of a unit, even if that unit resales, with time, it just becomes harder and harder to track the initial sale that had the covenant with it. And so actually with this, we are recommending keep the 30-year renewing covenant period, and then also just kind of communicate the benefits of homeownership, even with this restricted value. This is kind of going back to a lot of the conversations that we've had to date, but just in this particular case, no updates.
Any thoughts?
Just the recognition of what we talked about of, obviously the maintenance of the asset over time and 60 years or, what does that look like? And is there a consideration or other jurisdictions ever have units that exit the program?
That is an important thing to note, that this inherently means units never exit the program. But it is something to consider.
They never exit the program unless a household lives in that unit for more than 30 years, which is, I wouldn't say the most likely scenario, but isn't unheard of.
Right.
And I think that's sort of one area where we see our role as the, the ability to purchase the property is really important. So if you have, let's just say the extreme, like a hoarding situation or something, and then the property needs to be, to remain in the program, that could be an opportunity for us to kind of step in, purchase it, and then, restore it to be able to then have it continue on in its life.
Yeah, no, that's right.
All right.
That's good. Back on the resale. One of the second of the recommendations had to do with the RHA repurchasing.
So this is really about, it says reconsider, it's really more about communication. So just making sure that internal staff is very, very clear about under what scenarios the FCRHA would be looking to exercise its purchase right. So just sort of making that clear front so people know. That was really kind of what we were trying to get at.
Yeah, just there's not an assumption that the county's going to purchase. I don't have to make any capital improvements.
Yeah.
You are taking on risk as a homeowner that when you sell, it may not sell for the price you want. And there is an inherent risk in that and wanting, as you point out, some scenarios that the county would want to step in, limiting those scenarios though.
Thanks.
Right. So just kind of next steps, and this is sort of the last thing we'd want to talk through. So I think we've sort of talked a bit about at the beginning how we're going to use some of the feedback and assumptions that we were talking through in this meeting, kind of to make what we would call kind of a second set or the continuation of these recommendations. So the first thing that we're going to be looking into are the impacts of that new pricing we discussed on development financials. So what we want to understand is do changes to the WDU pricing and those changes to the AMI level served, how would it actually impact and require a change to the current bonus density structure? Would that need to be changed in some way to compensate for the fact we're slightly lowering pricing and we're targeting lower AMI levels, at least on the top end? The other thing that we're going to be looking into is what we touched on earlier, is the distribution of AMIs across AMI levels. So trying to understand if it makes sense to have an even distribution like what Tyson's has, or what it would take for there to be a different distribution, one that was maybe more heavily weighted toward the lower end of the AMI spectrum, or testing what would be required to change and lower the AMI threshold. That's what we're going to be testing to understand what the impact would be. Additionally, we had the conversation about the distribution of WDUs by bedroom count. I think we got a lot of feedback on different ways we might want to test that. So understanding if maybe there's a different ratio for producing larger units, but really trying to understand the financial impact of that recommendation and really being able to see if that recommendation is viable or how the incentives would need to be shifted in order to accommodate that goal. And then lastly, it's extending the program recommendations. And so the questions here are, should the Tyson's high-rise policy be extended to other areas that are zoned for high-density residential? And then, as we talked about earlier, should the WDU policy is really confined to certain development centers, but we know that there are planned developments that are occurring outside of these centers. And so should the WDU policy be extended? And so these are kind of the four questions that we're going to be looking into that will kind of round out the rest of our recommendations.
Questions about these?
In terms of extending the area where there's a WDU expectation, what are the inputs that are going into your analysis for that?
So I think one thing we would want to understand is areas that are currently have planned developments that aren't necessarily in these development centers, trying to understand if we think there's any differences in development financials. So do we think that the land costs are significantly different in those areas? Do we think that the achievable prices are significantly different in those areas? That would be a factor that we would look into. I mean, we are going to look into those scenarios. I think our initial hypothesis, though we certainly want to test this, would be that you would extend to those areas that there is additional development planned. thinking that whether that development occurs or not is less of a function of where the WDU program does or doesn't exist and more a function of development economics. We feel somewhat similar. Again, we're going to test our hypothesis to see if this is if this holds true, but on extending the high-rise policy outside of Tysons. We think that if there's other areas that are zoned for high-rise, whether or not a high-rise condominium can be built in that area is really a function outside of the WDU policy of just development economics. And so our thought, though again, something we'd want to test, is we don't necessarily see there being a significant difference. If high-rise condominium pencils in that location, we don't see why it would support or not support WDUs any differently than Tysons would.
I guess as part of that conversation, do we feel like we have enough experience with development in Tysons to be able to say it's working or it's not before we expand it?
I mean, it is, you know, that's always our challenge right here with the WDU program is that it is newer.
Yeah.
I think we might have to make some assumptions, and I think what we could have, you know, HRNA do is just like kind of catalog those for us when they come back with their recommendations, and then we can sort of look at those a little and just see, you know, do all those make sense? Because I think, yeah, I mean, naturally, just given the age, it's hard to.
To your point, Joe, I mean, you know, because you're supervisor's office, like there's one condo building right there in Tysons, so it's not, you don't have that market analysis. And I would venture to say Tysons is different in terms of just the market economics than other places in Fairfax County. But I'm interested to see what you come back.
We would certainly agree. I think this is also like where high-rise condo would actually be built is also just a very, very select. I mean, Tysons, maybe Reston, that it is somewhat, just because a policy is extended to areas, that doesn't necessarily mean that high-rise condos are going to be built in those areas because the underlying economics just might not support high-rise condos. That is like such a kind of specialized development type, and there's a reason that you don't really see them elsewhere in the county.
We had a high-rise condo approved in Reston. I don't know if it got built, but they specifically asked about why they're not a high-rise policy outside of Tysons. So that was one of the reasons we put it as for discussion. Is it appropriate?
You could make it less vital.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the analysis just hadn't happened, but this initial policy was implemented for Tysons.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I mean, I reserving judgment on extending geographically, but yeah, that is the one thing you don't want to do is if you want high-rise development in a certain area is to overburden it regulatory. And I think like you do a pilot like a bonus density pilot to see if sort of there's value in the additional or whatever incentive zoning policy that you're extending, but the market economics, like I said, I would reserve judgment until we see like what the market economics say for other areas. I know there are other parts of the county that comp plan allows for high-rise levels where it's not presently being built. If it's something that built now without the WDU policy, then whether you added a WDU policy there or not, may or may not make a material difference.
I think that's sort of our, at least, again, sort of our assumption is that this is just such a like unique specialized product that can currently only work in the county in like such a finite number of locations, like separate from where it could be allowed under zoning, that it is a little bit of just a question of does, generally speaking, the underlying financials of high-rise support this kind of WDU program, and answering that, that's sort of where we're thinking the analysis is going to land. That sort of be why would we treat Reston different than Tysons if those are the only two places that high-rise currently would be considered and would be built?
I just want to make sure, because I missed it, but the high-rise policy in Tysons is an incentive, right? Because it is less than what the for-sale policy is right now.
I don't know if I would call it an incentive. I think
No,
it's
but
a
it's
different
right.
regulatory framework
Right, it's
for
lower-
sale versus the rest.
There's a lower expectation of WDUs to encourage high-rise development.
Well, I think
to-
it's-
To not discourage.
Yeah, I think to make it more economically viable.
Right.
Yeah.
So the answer, you treat Reston separately to Tyson's because it's the center of the universe, if you ask anyone from
Oh.
Reston.
I mean, that sort of raises the question, I mean, are we actually touching Reston with this policy change?
Well, potentially, yeah, it would come after the Reston plan, but we've always acknowledged that this was ongoing during the Reston plan. The Reston plan keeps brought forward the for sale as is, brought forward the, it keeps the sliding scale that was in the Reston plan, which is not in the general policy, and kept it 12%, which is in the current Reston plan versus 8% countywide rental. But it didn't make any changes for the for sale because they knew this was going forward. We always talked to the task force. We need to get this worked out, and that was one of the follow-on motions they asked for Supervisor Alcorn to do, was to essentially do this process, because obviously are.
And just a reminder, when we're coming out of this process, we're coming out with a set of recommendations. We'll speak with the board about those recommendations in November. That doesn't automatically mean that we're going right into a new format, because we still have to move through preparing a comprehensive plan amendment and doing outreach on it and going through the hearing process. So there's that other step that's involved, and that step will also look at, how we would address any recommendations in Tyson's. Or sorry, in Reston, excuse me.
Questions, comments? That's all we've got. Any last things you want to bring up? No? Megan, anything? Good. Okay, I guess
Our next meeting. Our next meeting is 28th.
Okay, well then I guess we'll adjourn early again.
Let's do this. If anyone has
Are there any, sorry, I apologize. Is anybody on the teams that would like to have any last questions or thoughts? I know, it's crickets. Okay, well then I guess, thank you again for coming, and we will see everybody in 2 weeks.
Thank you, guys.
Good to see you, man. How you doing?